Hi, y'all. So today I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about Group 1's PowerPoint and presentation. They did a really good job being super concise. And so I wanted to just take a couple of minutes, obviously, to kind of talk through it. So you can kind of see who the group leaders are. And for those of you who are in my 9:30 class, the 9:30 group actually decided to hand in individual papers. So this is a presentation I think that both of my classes can look at. So I think that'll really help. Okay, so in looking at what this chapter's about, and I know you already watched the short video on the McMartin case, we're really looking at tainted interviews. And in the past, my faculty has kind of said, oh, this chapter is really hard hitting. It's difficult for students. It talks about difficult topics. And I agree. Talking about some of the stuff in the chapter can be difficult to talk about, like sexual abuse, assault, and very weird stuff too, right? The reason why I want you to pay attention to this chapter is next week, we're going to actually look at chapter 5 that looks at the law system, the police, the justice system. And the justice system has this exact problem as well. I think this chapter on tainted interviewing is really eye-opening for me the first time I read it, because there's so many stigmas attached to therapy and therapists, but there's also a lot of knowledge that we can take from this. So number one, in looking at the slide here, they're basically telling us what tainted interviewing is. A tainted interview is where a witness, especially children, are susceptible to influence. This could be due to coercion or even suggestive questioning. Now, in the video I had you watch, just remember the puppets, how, and I think the group actually does this in the next slide. The question is, are unsupervised interviews between adults and children safe? And that's really interesting to kind of think about. What they have listed here is that children specifically, because they're easier to influence, and also, can we really trust these healthcare providers? Now, this is a dangerous thing to start talking about, obviously, because we want to trust our doctors. We do know they make mistakes. We want to trust our nurses and our therapists. But remember, we're all fallible and we all make mistakes. So the example that they gave with Susan Kelly here, what I liked about this slide specifically is this questioning right here. Kelly, did anyone touch your bum? No. Would you tell Bert? The child is actually saying, no, this did not happen to me. And the problem is these types of tainted interview questions, I think I talked about this in the beginning of the semester, can lead you to answer something faulty or answer with a faulty answer. It's not who touched you or did they touch you. The question is where. Okay, and that kind of changes the question for the child. Now imagine how stressful this is. There's no parent in the room. The child doesn't know what's going on, and then they're asked these leading questions. And I like this, the catch-22. Now what does this mean? A catch-22 is defined as a dilemma or difficult circumstance from which there is no escape. So, this is a problem because we want to keep our children safe, correct? And if they really were, let's say, sexually assaulted, if there really was a problem, we would want to put whoever did this in jail. But the problem is that when, as you saw in the video, when one person says, this might have happened, let's send a letter to all parents. Think about how you would react if you were a parent sitting in a room and I just told you, you better watch out. Maybe your child has been abused. Maybe something happened to them. You would go running home and try to find a way to get your child to admit to it. So this is how this moral panic kind of occurred. And the group does a really good job talking about therapy coercion. Here's another slide. They're kind of asking the question, well, why would a therapist use coercion? And basically, there's a checklist, and after a while, you become pretty confident that you can see abuse. Usually when I have my students in the room, I'll have you look at the way you are sitting. So think about the way you're sitting right now. My hands are clasped. Maybe I'm bouncing my feet. Maybe I'm twisting my head. I could look at you and say, oh, you're guilty. I could look at you and say, you may be depressed. All because of the way you're sitting. And so a therapist treats this a little bit differently. They use coercion in a way that it has been this way forever, or this is the way were taught. They saw 6 patients who reacted this way, and now they use that as their guideline. And so the question is, well, why would an adult so easily believe and accept these claims? It gives an explanation for problems in personal life. And I really like that. And maybe you can think about that too. Do we agree when people kind of give us an out and give us a way to look at maybe our problems and issues we're having? This other slide is also from Mary. She talks about other forms of coercion, and hypnosis is something that maybe you've seen in movies, maybe you've seen in a book, and it says here that 66% of trained clinicians received their hypnosis education in non-academic workshops. This brings up the question, is this something that we should rely on then, right? Just like you guys have to go out and find the best resources, is this the best source? Now, remember, I'm running through this really quickly because I don't want to overwhelm you with a really long video. I will have their PowerPoint attached to the end of the video, and you can kind of go back through it on your own. This slide, I love the example they're giving here. Coercion is not just used on children. It can actually be used for different situations as well. So what is a closed loop? So this is where I wanted to get today for you, and I want to make sure that we got here. So this is probably the most important concept. This is also a concept in the quiz, so maybe just take a second and look at it. In your book, I do note, and they actually note here, so great job group. It's on page 132. Okay, so it says, what is a closed loop? And I want you to think about, if you can see my mouse, something that just continually goes in a circle, okay? This concept describes the system-like closed loop that many in clinical practices face in regards to how they individually handle situations based solely on what they see, that then shapes what they believe, and what they believe further cements what they see. Now, this sounds like confirmation bias, doesn't it? Like we seek information to benefit our answer that we already kind of have, or our opinion. Now, what this means is kind of like what I was saying. Let's say I've been treating patients for 6 years. 6 of these patients I saw all had similar backstories, similar issues, even down to the way they dressed, the way they sat. And because of that, I knew that they were bipolar. And so I got pretty good at figuring out who was bipolar. And based upon that evidence, I could wrongly suggest to a patient that they're bipolar just based upon all of those things I'd already seen. Now, your book makes a really good point that there's no one looking over their shoulder. Remember, these are closed door therapy sessions. So there's no one correcting their mistakes, perhaps. And it's up to these therapists to kind of own their mistakes and say, yes, I made a mistake. This is not the right diagnosis. So keep this in mind. They ask, why would this cause issues? Many clinical practices are handled between the client and professional. There is a lack of outside input. So that's basically what I was just saying. And there's no buffer between the main therapist and other professionals. Important input to correctly aid the client in need of assistance. So think about our TED Talk with the doctor. Kind of the same thing, right? There's no one he could talk to. No one talks about the mistakes they've made. And so if you look on pages 130 to 132, this is a great point that I brought up in my module already about the difference between what a psychologist is, a psychiatrist, a therapist. So maybe go back and review that. And then they kind of continue this closed loop example. So if you're confused about the closed loop, maybe go back to the PowerPoint and look through it, okay? If we're looking at this slide, now we kind of get into false memories, something we briefly talked about in chapter 3. What is a false memory? False memories occur when a person recalls something that did not happen or actually happened that was differently how it was. Now, sometimes you read, that therapists can actually do this and evoke a false memory. We think to ourselves sometimes, how is that possible? How could a therapist convince me that something happened and it didn't really happen? This is going to be important, though, because in the next chapter, we're going to ask the question, how does an innocent person say, yes, I did this terrible crime when they're innocent? What brings them to that point? Okay, and so that's what we're going to try to think about in relation to this example of false memories. So they're giving a really good example here about Grace, who was having a panic attack, and kind of goes through the false memory example and hypnosis. So maybe go back and look through this. It's a really, really good example. This group also talks through what the qualitative nature of psychology. So what we're looking at this is basically how psychology is, remember, very, very subjective. And it's based upon your opinions, your point of view. But on an individual level, patients tended to, by psychologists, they write, have to be helped in an individual manner instead of a cookie cutter approach. And so this kind of goes back to what I was talking about. When we are being very subjective in the way we see things, sometimes it's difficult to quantify all of my bipolar patients look like this. Okay. Now my video is set that I can only have 15 minutes, so I'm sorry I'm running through this. But this is a really good example of what they're talking through, the qualitative nature of psychology, how they use these clinical predictions in order to actually treat patients. And now remember, any assumption can be negative, right? And so we have to be careful when we assume things. Doctors, lawyers, police officers, and even therapists make assumptions. And so that is basically what we are going to be looking at the next couple of weeks. And then the last slide here just kind of gives you an example of where the qualitative nature of psychology exists. And this is on page 130. So you can kind of look back through this. They don't have any discussion questions, so we're going to come up with one for your discussion this week. I just wanted to put these quiz questions up here so that you can preview them. And please go back and look through their whole PowerPoint.